From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Makeshift structures and small tents dot city parks, public spaces, anywhere people with nowhere to go can find refuge. Toronto's affordable housing crisis has worsened in the pandemic, with more people having their hours cut back or having lost their jobs and faced eviction. The city says around 400 people live in encampments. Outreach workers and homeless advocates say there are more than 1,000 people living in them. This is what it's like to be out there.
This country is in a crisis situation right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic that's bouncing up and down, and I really don't see any time of it ending soon. People are afraid. You know what? Here in the park, we all feel safe.
That's Dom. His friends call him Bubbles, but you gotta earn that nickname with him. He's been living in Alexandra Park for the past 2 years and has been homeless for 4. When I reached Dom on the phone, he's in the middle of retarping his structure after some snow leaked in. It's a reminder about the harsh elements he faces every day, especially in winter. He tells me about the life he's carved out and the community he's helped build.
I've done the same thing since I've been out here. When I came up here and put my tent up and I let 1 or 2 people stay in the tent with me when it was raining, I'm thinking, I should get a bigger tent, and I got a bigger tent. Then something clicked in my head, I just put myself a little plex inside here with a couple of tents and a canopy, and then I put it together. Like I told you, while I'm out here, I might as well do something positive. Turn a negative into a positive. I earned the people's trust in this park. They just don't trust you all of a sudden. You earn that out here on the streets with blood and tears, with actions. Actions speak louder than words.
Dom says he's seen more and more people end up in parks. The shelter system for many simply isn't an option. Most nights it's at capacity. There are just way more people in need than there are beds. And when there is space, many don't feel safe.
In the shelters, people go into the showers, try to pull a knife on you, take your wallet, take all your belongings off you. And if you open your mouth, him and his friends will get you outside. The intimidations. You know what? I've had so many scraps in the shelter system, I've lost count. I got too many scars on my face. Enough is enough. Days in there feel like weeks. Weeks feel like months. Like I said, I just couldn't deal with the shelter system anymore, Adrian.
Then there's COVID. Many shelters are congregate living, meaning many people in one space, which is an easy way for disease to spread. Dom says many like him would rather take their chances on the streets or create their own shelter in the encampments. Then he starts talking about the helpers, the part of Toronto that thinks about people out in the cold. Volunteer groups like the Toronto Encampment Support Network, who deliver basic supplies like water, sleeping bags, food, and fire safety equipment to the camps.
There's a lot of awesome people in this city. Great people with big hearts. And when they realized what was going on out here, they came out to help us.
And people like Khalil Siebright, the Toronto carpenter who's built temporary shelters for homeless people since last fall. Siebright's name has made headlines because the city of Toronto served an injunction against him to make him stop building the insulated shelters.
One man has done more for this city and the people in this city, the homeless people, than the government, okay? He went out and he's provided housing for hundreds of people since the pandemic has started, okay? Hundreds of people. What has the government done since the pandemic come?
The problem, the one that lies beyond people surviving in a park, is one of affordable housing. And the irony isn't lost on Dom of the life he lives now and the one he had before. Because there was a before. Before he was homeless, Dom worked for more than 20 years in construction, building many of the high-rise condos that make up downtown Toronto's skyline. He knows the lead time and how quickly those towers can be built. He helped create them. He still sees the cranes in the sky when he looks up from his encampment in the park. And he says if there's a will and money, there is a way.
People need housing in this country, quick. And it's buildable. Man, it's buildable. I know construction works. It's not so advanced. Like the Plex behind me, they can slap a Plex up behind me in like 9 months. And the Plex behind me is pretty big, okay? And they can house at least 500, 600, 700 people in there. That's one Plex. The government needs to wake up. Start building affordable housing. It's in the pipeline. Unclog the pipe. Stop building your condominiums and start mapping out some land to put some affordable housing down for disabled people, for people with low incomes. You know, not everybody has the same incomes in this country, and not everybody can afford the same type of money. It doesn't mean people should have to live like rats or cockroaches.
The City of Toronto says it's helped more than 1,300 people move into indoor spaces since the start of the pandemic. But encampment evictions continue, and Dom says he and many others aren't going anywhere. They're here.
We all look after each other. Bubbles, you take your meds? Yes. All right, good boy. You know, I didn't get that before. These people treat me like family. We're all like family out here. And you know what? If the city thinks they can strong arm us and bully us with police and threats of bulldozers and all this crap that they've done in other encampments, well, you come over here and try it. You come here and try it.
Coming up, we talk to Lorraine Lam, outreach worker for Sanctuary Toronto. Lorraine has been working with Toronto's homeless for a decade. She'll talk about the big, long-standing problems, why COVID has made things even tougher, and what she thinks our city and its leaders should do to fix it. Lorraine, thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
From your outreach work, what are the conditions like for people living in the encampments right now, especially as we're in the depths of winter?
I would say things are pretty tough, to be honest. We have been asking the city since the pandemic started for even things like washrooms to be made available, but there are no bathrooms anywhere. So that's a pretty basic human need. It's cold outside, things are wet. So I think the reality is there are very limited resources for people who are vulnerable, and there are certain people in the community who are feeling the weight of that more than others.
You've been working in the space of helping homeless people for a decade now, but what did the situation look like leading up to the pandemic? And do you think that the situation has gotten worse?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. The situation has gotten worse. I would say before the pandemic, the housing crisis in the city was already pretty bad. A number of us who work in this sector have been pushing various levels of government to declare it as a state of emergency. For some context, for instance, if somebody is on the waiting list for rent geared to income housing, the average wait for a bachelor apartment is about 10 years. And for a one bedroom, it's at least 12 years. So the reality is the housing crisis in Toronto is out of control. I would say that even before the pandemic, we knew that the numbers were bad. So in 2018, for instance, the estimate is that there were about 10,000 people who were homeless in the city. And we know that the numbers have increased, especially with the pandemic and people losing work and having been evicted and whatnot. So this is not new. I would say the pandemic actually just made a lot of the realities more visible for people as we saw a lot more tents and encampments in more open spaces.
When we talk about the encampments, is there a definitive number on how many people are living in the encampments? I mean, I've seen advocates say that there might be more than 1,000 people who are living in these tented areas. The city back in December said that there were around 400. So there seems to be a difference in opinion in terms of the types of numbers.
Yeah, so our number in terms of over 1,000 people who sleep rough, we don't specifically count just encampments. So there's a number of people I know, for instance, who ride the overnight streetcars to try to stay warm. There's a lot of people who live in sort of more hidden areas. But we know that the city's number is below what we believe is true because, for instance, when they go to an encampment, they count tents. So let's say they go to one park and they see there are 5 tents, so therefore 5 people live here. But what we do know is sometimes there are 5 or 6 people in one tent. So tents are not an accurate number in terms of the actual number of people who are living outside. So there is a disparity between what the city is saying in terms of how many people sleep rough versus what we know based on our work and what we see.
Toronto's shelter system houses thousands of people every night, but we often hear, and this was even true before the pandemic, that it's overcrowded. And that was in what we would now call the best of times, about that capacity being around 98, 99% every single night. Why are current shelters at the current level? Why are they not the answer?
Shelters are really just a Band-Aid solution. I mean, at this point, we were told that, we should be socially isolating and whatnot. We should be distancing. But shelters at the end of the day are congregate settings, right? So some of the bigger ones, there's hundreds of people in one space with shared accommodation. So it really is not safe, especially through the lens of COVID. Again, this is something that we have been pushing for since before the pandemic, that we actually need solutions that are not just about, temporary shelters, but what people really want is long-term permanent housing. And so in light of COVID, the city, talks about opening up a bunch of new spaces and whatnot, but the number is still very, very inadequate. And even the city website now shows that a lot of their spaces are at capacity.
We'll be right back. So even the shelter system as it exists right now, and with the city committing to more shelter space by opening that up in hotels, these are more short-term ideas. What do you think are some of the bigger problems that have gone unaddressed for years?
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier that the wait list for housing right now is very, very long. So there is just no supply of housing. So for instance, a lot of these hotel shelters right now are leased until the end of the year. But what happens when the lease is up? Right? Because we have nowhere for people to go. I think that's one issue. I think the other reality is that social income rates are very, very low. So if somebody is on welfare, for instance, their monthly basic needs check is about $350. And that's how much somebody on welfare has to live for the month. And so let's say somebody is able to get a landlord who is willing to sign a statement to say, okay, I'm willing to rent my place to them. What welfare does is they offer like a rent supplement on top of the basic needs. And if you're on welfare, the rent supplement that you get is about $379. So your entire check combined, your basic needs and the rent supplement is just around $700. And like being in Toronto, like you can't find a decent place for $700 a month. So social income assistance rates have been really, really low so that people just have no way to be able to afford any kind of private market rent, even if that was available. And so a lot of people now then have to rely on subsidized housing. And the reality, that list is so long. So the social assistance rates is something that needs to be addressed immediately. And that is a provincial level thing for sure.
So you're saying that not only is it the system in place that makes it difficult for people to get housing, it's in terms of the day-to-day affordability that is extremely high and out of reach, clearly, for thousands of people.
Yeah, so many people. I see amongst my peers as well, right? So many people are having to live with roommates and stuff like that because it's just so hard to find a place for one person that's in some kind of affordable range. So I think a lot of people talk about like, oh, we have this homelessness crisis. But I actually think the reality is we have an affordability crisis. People can't afford housing and there's no supply. And those two things coming together, they're creating a giant, giant problem of homelessness.
So what do you think the city of Toronto should be doing? Because advocates have called for, obviously in the immediate short term, to help people through this winter. They want more shelter space, more beds, more funding for supplies to go to people in the encampments. But in the long term, what should they be doing? Like, I understand the affordability there, but should they be building more affordable housing? Should there be greater resources put into the shelter system? Already hundreds of millions are being put there, but does there need to be more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the city, approved all of these luxury condos that go up. And I think there needs to be some responsibility in terms of like developing housing for people who can't afford the luxury condos. Even just on the street where I work, there used to be a number of rooming houses on the street that have been torn down and replaced by condos. And when these rooming houses were torn down, a lot of those people ended up homeless. One of the guys actually just died a couple of weeks ago. He had to leave his rooming house because it was getting torn down for this luxury development. He had nowhere to go and no stability. So I think the city has a responsibility to play in terms of what kind of developments and housing gets built. We talk a lot about expropriating older buildings, so we can definitely do work there. And then there's also a large conversation happening about reallocating resources. So the conversations around defunding the police is actually really important in this conversation as well, because the idea of defunding the police is that the money can be spent elsewhere on resources that we desperately need. So why are we spending so much money on a police budget when we know that like policing doesn't actually resolve a lot of the root causes of issues? Like police now have to respond to a lot of calls that actually, I'm convinced if people just had access to resources and stability, the police wouldn't need to be involved. So that's actually how the defunding police conversation is incredibly relevant in the conversation about homelessness and housing, because the city talks about not having enough money. Well, I think we can find the money elsewhere.
You've also on social media talked about how there's a lot of empty spaces in Toronto right now, whether they be the lobbies of office buildings or in Union Square. You also, I believe on Instagram, you showed how benches and spaces where people can sit, they're being removed.
This outreach worker recently shot videos inside Union Station, places for people to sit and warm up, taken away or made off limits. She'd like the city to do something.
Do you think in terms of how our public spaces are being used during the pandemic, does that send a clear message about perhaps where some of the priorities are?
Absolutely. I think the conversation about public space, we know that it's not for all public, right? We talk about parks being for public use, but throughout the last number of years, I've seen benches at various parks get removed, and coincidentally, these happen to be parks where a lot of homeless people are. So I think the reality of hostile infrastructure and hostile architecture definitely sends a very loud message about which people are welcome in certain spaces. I would say that even, in the parks beside sanctuary, there's conversations about what seating can look like. And there's a huge push for not benches, but simply little cube squares for people to sit on. So you can't lie down. There's no leaning against anything. It's just a sitting spot. And again, I think the idea is to discourage people from lying down or gathering in groups.
Yeah, it's called hostile design.
Yes, hostile design. It's something that we're seeing in many, many large cities. Benches that maybe used to not have any armrests now have armrests, or they're cold and metal, So I think there's a lot of different things that city infrastructure does to speak a message of who is welcome and who isn't welcome. And specifically at Union Station, the space was one of the last resort options for people to go to warm up, to charge up their mobility devices. And just in a matter of a week and a half or 2 weeks, also coincidentally around the cold snap, is when we saw a lot of the benches get taped up, get stacked away. And I know that the narrative that Metrolinx has been saying is that, it's to promote social distancing. And we've been doing that since the start of the pandemic. But what I know from the community is that that's actually untrue, right? And also when you remove benches, you don't actually encourage distancing. Instead, you encourage people to gather in the small limited spaces in what's left. So I think there's definitely some very loud messaging coming across here.
For people who are housed, they often see the encampments growing bigger and bigger, especially in the fall and into the winter. These encampments in these parks were growing bigger and bigger. And there was a lot of hand-wringing about what exactly this meant and why they kept growing. But for people perhaps who aren't talking to unhoused people every day, aren't working in the community every day like you do, what do you think they don't see? What are they missing out on?
I think people don't see the amount of work it takes to try to survive every day. For somebody who's sleeping outside, if I know that, for instance, the weather is going to be cold tonight, I'm going to try to find a place to go to warm up. It is so hard to find anywhere to go to warm up. It is so hard to find a bathroom. I met someone last week. I offered him a coffee in the evening and he said, no, I don't drink anything past 8 o'clock because there are no overnight washrooms anywhere. So I think people don't see just how many steps and how many barriers there are for somebody who is on the street to just survive every day. And I think that's something that we need to recognize. I also think people don't see actually how people who are on the street, a lot of them have been here for a long time. And we don't give them enough credit for just the amount of ways that they have survived, the amount of strength, the amount of creativity, the amount of resourcing that they've had to figure out. I think that's something that I am so impressed by and so moved by every day. And I also think it's important to recognize that people who are on the street deserve the same amount of dignity as those who are not on the street. And they have a voice and they know what it is that they need in order to thrive, in order to succeed. People have the right to make dignified choices. And a lot of these people are people with stories and names. They are brothers, their sisters, their sons, their daughters, their fathers, their mothers, their aunts and uncles. I think it's really important to remember that when we talk about a community or when we talk about residents of a neighborhood, all of those people need to be included in that conversation as well.
I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between people who build these communities, of people who live on the street, and also people with a certain amount of privilege who are trying to help this situation. And this past week, there's been a lot of attention on Khalil Siebright. Our listeners may know that name because he's a carpenter in Toronto who has built tiny shelters for people in the encampments. And the news part of this is that he's been served an injunction from the city to stop building those homes because the city says he's interfering with them moving people into safer indoor spaces.
My name's Khalil Siebright, and this is a statement that I've prepared. I started building tiny shelters so that some of the most vulnerable could have somewhere warm to go. The shelters I built are a small part of a temporary solution to keep people alive until they can access alternative housing.
When you hear of someone like Khalil in the community and you see the city's response, what do you make of that?
I respect Khalil so much. He saw a problem. He saw that the city was not stepping up, and he decided that he was going to use the skills that he had to fill in a gap that the city was failing to address. So I have so much respect for his heart, for his energy, for his work, for his vision. When the city talks about, oh, Khalil is the one interfering, I would push back very strongly on that, because when people are given offers that work for them, when people are given actual safe options, they'll take them. And I've seen that happen actually with so many people who I knew were at one point camping in various parks. And when they were actually offered something that made sense to them, they took it. So I think when the city issues this injunction, they're deflecting a lot of the responsibility that they have and have failed in terms of providing supports to the most vulnerable people. And now they've just scapegoated somebody else who's doing the work that they're not doing.
Lorraine, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
And that is Lorraine Lam, outreach worker speaking to us from Sanctuary Toronto. Groups like Sanctuary Toronto, Toronto Encampment Support Network, and Street Nurses continue to work on the ground with homeless people in the city. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.